Once upon a time, in a very small village, there lived a very beautiful young lady. One day a noble prince appeared before her who, as in all fairy tales, was beautiful. He approached the girl and, holding out the crown to her, said that he was in love with her and would give her anything she wanted as long as she would marry him. However, after that, a very brave knight appeared, who also confessed his love to the beauty. He was going to give her his sword, which he used to defend the empire, and he also asked that she marry him. And afterward came a rich merchant who, like all those others, professed his love for her and said he would give her all the gold he had. Man, like the others, I wanted her to marry him. The girl pondered all these suggestions for a long time, but unfortunately she bowed and waved them all away, saying she couldn't give them an answer just yet. The three men were incredibly surprised, but they soon left, realizing that they did not intend to wait. Later, however, when they had waited long enough for her to be ready, when the men returned, there the young lady was already committed to the cold ground. In the garden where she was buried, flowers bloomed that she had never even seen before. Their buds were crown-shaped, their leaves were sword-shaped, and their roots were like bunches of gold. But that was not yet the greatest oddity to be noticed. The young lady did not reject the marriage proposal. The only thing she said was that she couldn't answer for sure at the time. One cavalier firmly believed it meant only waiting, so he waited for her to the end. That's how a lot of time went by. Their daughter snowed in all kinds of weather. He sat by the place where she was buried and looked at the flowers that never wilted. He sat and waited for her all the time, never giving up hope. He believed that one day she would definitely accept his proposal. And so quite some time had passed since then, and at last the young lady was back after all. But when she came to the place where she was buried, it was too late. She was at the place and cried loudly, for she knew that he had been waiting for her all along, but she was not in time. That's when that girl swore to herself that she would offend greatly and asked that the man keep his promise in return. However, this story begins at a different point. In the blacksmith shop, a man approached a girl with very blonde hair. Her name was Leah. He stopped her halfway through and anxiously asked if she was sure she could manage on her own, for she must deliver this sword to the Gyomu commander. And indeed, the girl had a huge bundle in her hands. It was a weapon for this very commander. But at that moment a voice suddenly came from inside the house. It was a woman. She started coughing and asked the man where he had disappeared to. The blacksmith was very worried about this, and immediately shouted back to her that he was very close by and was not going anywhere. Then he started to go back and asked if the baby had already been born. The man was about to leave, but Leah suddenly grabbed his arm. He said they had to get to the boat and leave immediately, and she said in a calm voice that she would tell him everything, so her father wouldn't have to worry about it. In fact, it had been a month and a half since Castle Acre had been attacked by the Mamluk army. The number of Knights Templar barely reached 1,000 men, while the Mamluk army was simply countless. And despite the overwhelming numerical difference, the knights fought with amazing bravery. Commanders ordered soldiers to defend their homeland and take back the lost Holy Land back. By that time, Leah had already traveled to give this sword, but then suddenly she fell down from surprise, because right in front of her nose flew an arrow, which crashed into a tree. The girl was very surprised at this event, and for a while just sat there silent. Well, then suddenly she heard someone screaming for help, and right in front of her she saw a horrifying picture. There were several bodies lying not far from Leah, bleeding, and one guy ran up to another, trying to stop the blood. He asked him to wake up, but it was no use. The girl only watched all this in surprise, but she knew very well that sooner or later such a thing would happen. Leah sat on the floor and decided her defense to say that she just couldn't walk. She was scared, and so were her mom and dad. In fact, she was so scared that she couldn't even move normally. The girl, seeing all those corpses, closed her eyes and turned away. She couldn't just watch it all. But at that moment she suddenly heard someone's voice shouting at her to be careful. Leah immediately looked up to see what was going on and who was yelling. But as soon as she looked up, she saw a huge rock flying right at her, and it wasn't even going to stop. After a while, she was lying unconscious. She lay on the floor for a while, but soon she began to wake up, not understanding why she was in pain or what had happened. After all, she just wanted to become a well-paid craftsman and marry a handsome knight. And if it hadn't been for Mom's morning labor pains, they might have left even sooner. And if her ugly yellow-toothed fiancé Vincent hadn't run off with 40 gold florins, her family would have been on the boat that takes people away from this horrible place long ago. But in fact, if you look at it another way, Vincent's escape was a good thing for the girl. And when she found out about it, she began to thank St. Michael the Archangel for hearing her prayers. The girl lay on the floor and remembered all the events that had happened just recently, and how she had even come to where she was now. Leah was sitting in the workshop helping her father when suddenly a letter from Mr. Guillaume came in. Her father was very surprised, for it was quite late. He came closer to the knight, and the latter was holding a huge bundle in his hands. Amos, the girl's father, asked him what he was saying, for he spoke too softly to hear the information. However, the knight moved closer to him and told him to keep his voice down, for this was very important information that no one must know, and from outsiders. The knight asked that Amos repair the knives and return them to him immediately. The man, of course, agreed to this, and when the door closed, he immediately turned to his daughter, asking that she listen to him with the utmost attention. Amos said that now that the battle for Virgin was in full swing, Commander Guillaume would be in the tower. She should deliver the item personally to the commander and return home immediately afterward. When he handed the girl the bundle, a little girl ran up to them and was in tears. She turned to Leah and asked her sister if she would be back soon. The girl looked very scared. Her name was Rachel, and she was her sweet little sister. The girl asked Leah to come back soon. And now, as the girl lay on the ground and remembered it all, she realized that her sweet little sister shouldn't cry when she wasn't around. The girl clenched her teeth, and through the pain began to climb out of that rock. Even though it was incredibly hard, Leah knew she didn't have time for this. She made a lot of effort, and in great pain even began to shout at the whole street. But soon the girl still managed to get her leg out of the stone that had crushed her. She crawled out a little farther and was able to reach a small stick that was nearby. Leah ripped a small piece of fabric from her skirt and, placing the stick against her leg, taped it to secure it. The girl then began to look around for the sheath she had dropped a short time ago in that strike. And crawling a little to the side, she saw a small bundle with just what she was supposed to take. But when Leah picked them up, she was very surprised, for they were somehow broken in two. This made her very sad, and she didn't know what to do now. She thought about going back to the smithy and fixing them and then going again. But then she realized that her dad would faint if he saw how broken they were. Leah thought about the fact that they still had a way out after all. They had booked a boat and could just run away, but quickly dismissed these thoughts from her mind. After all, she didn't want to be a fugitive for the rest of her life. At that moment she turned the scabbard over the other side and saw that there was something drawn there, as well as written in some ancient language. The girl was educated enough to read. It said that God wills, God chooses, and also God heals. Then she turned the scabbard over the other side to see if there was any writing, and she was right. It said that the rod and staff would guide them. Leah had been reading those words in circles for a while, trying to figure out what they even meant, but she still couldn't figure it out. Then the girl thought about what she should do. She didn't understand how the thing could break so smoothly, because it didn't look like it had been broken by a strong blow. Now that she thought about it, she realized that this scabbard was broken, but the sword was perfectly fine. And looking at it more closely, she didn't understand why it was so thin in the first place. Leah began to examine this pouch from all sides, and as she probed the insides, she noticed something strange. She brought the scabbard closer to her eyes and saw that there was a special device inside it. Examining the little prongs on all sides, she guessed that this thing wasn't broken, and thanks to her father it was saved after all. Leah fastened the two pieces together, which fit perfectly and were as slender as metal. The girl now understood why that commander had come to her father and not to the blacksmith. Her father also knew quite a bit about different stones and materials, but he was best at being a jeweler. The girl's father was the only one in Castle Acres who could fix something like this. After all, it was made completely differently from all the other things. Her father served in the war as a porter before settling in Acres Castle itself. He became famous for his skill in forging precious metals. Passed down from his grandfather, he's put his heart and soul into this business. And there's a reason for that. It's because it's a lucrative business. Thanks to this business, you can make a lot of money. because almost no one knows how to handle gemstones professionally. Leah quickly got up and again wrapped that sword in cloths and went on her way. She was overjoyed and thanked the Lord for her salvation. A lot more time had passed since then, and the girl finally reached her desired destination. It was already getting dark outside when she finally found herself in the castle. Leah went upstairs and started shouting the commander's name, but no one answered. She looked around and asked one of the soldiers where Commander Guillaume was, because she had something urgent to tell him. The girl walked a little further, calling out the commander's name, but then suddenly she didn't look carefully ahead and bumped into one of the warriors. The man turned back to see who he had bumped into. He thought it was one of his partners and asked him to tell the commander, but he didn't have time to finish the sentence when he saw the girl in front of him. The warrior removed his mask and moved closer, asking if he was correct in his understanding that she was the daughter of Master Amos. The girl, when she saw him, was very surprised and asked if he was Marshal Sierra, but the man smiled and said that he had told her more than once to call him Uncle Pierre. Hadn't he? Leah calmed down a little, for she knew the man well. He often came to their workshop, and she was glad she'd met him in the first place. Pierre, seeing something in her hands, asked if she had something she wanted to say to the Guillaume commander right here and now. Well, taking a closer look at her item, he wondered if it was the commander's sword. Leah pulled it closer to her and said that was right. The commander had left it with them last night, and she had been told to be sure to give it back this day. Pierre held out his hand and said that he could pass on, because this place is very dangerous. So we should go back as soon as possible. Leah began to hesitate. She moved farther away from him and didn't know what to do. It wasn't that the girl didn't trust him. However, they would have to pay if this sword suddenly went missing. So she turned to him and told him that this thing was very precious. So she needed to personally give this to the commander. The man was very surprised at this behavior, but with a heavy sigh he said he would take her to him. He also asked her to follow him and stay as close to the wall as possible. Outside, the sun was already beginning to set over the horizon, and soon they did arrive at their destination. Pierre came closer to the uniformed men and shouted the name of Guillaume's commander. Leah, seeing all this, was very happy, for now all she had to do was deliver the sword and return to her home. But she was so happy and engrossed in her thoughts that she did not even notice how Pierre suddenly stopped, and she crashed into him. The man, for his part, was looking away. Then he shifted his gaze to the commander, who was sitting nearby, and stepping closer to him, asked what was even going on. And Pierre said indignantly, for he himself had said all along that the Knights Templar never retreated. The commander said in a quiet voice that he was and did not retreat. Then the knights encircled him on the other sides, and Pierre saw the commander bleeding, and he said on an exhalation that he was dying. Pierre, when he saw all this, immediately started using foul language and screaming. He did not expect to see the Guillaume in such a terrible position. He turned to the rest of the knights and asked that they carry the stretcher urgently, then approached the commander and asked that he come to his senses. But the commander didn't answer anything. He just lay there and continued to bleed. Leah, who slowly came up behind him, didn't understand what to do, and didn't know if he was really dead at all. The girl began to feel very worried, for she did not know what would happen to Castle Lacour in such a case, nor what she should do with the sword she had brought. However, her musings were quickly interrupted because behind them, there were enemies who had managed to climb that high and were trying to capture the castle. There was a lot of bloodshed and confrontations. The Knights of the Empire of Acre defended the castle as best they could, but their opponents had better weapons. When most of the knights had been slaughtered, one of the enemy looked at the girl who was sitting nearby, shivering with fear. Their gazes met, and Leah knew this was not going to end well. Then she heard Pierre's voice, telling her to duck. At this moment, he went around behind her and released one huge arrow, which flew at the enemy with tremendous speed. And in a few seconds he fell to the ground, struck by that arrow, and began to bleed to death. The death was not instantaneous, but rather quick. Pierre then went to attack another enemy who was standing nearby and began beating him, knocking him to the ground. Leah, for her part, stayed on the ground not far from it all and just watched, not knowing what to do. The girl took a closer look at the confraternity that was not far from her, and noticed that there was no cross on his uniform. That meant he was an unofficial Knight Templar, and he didn't even seem to be a knight. a commoner. Leah speculated that he could probably be a knight apprentice, but she didn't know for sure who this mysterious man who had saved her life was. Then suddenly the voice of Pierre was heard, who had also emerged from the confrontation. He turned to Baltia and asked that he leave it to someone else, but he himself drew his sword and protected the child, taking her to the knight's headquarters. The man put his arm around Leah's waist so she wouldn't be too far away from him and covered their heads with a shield. Then he turned to the girl and asked if she could run. The girl shifted her gaze to her bandaged leg, which was still beginning to swell with time, and said she couldn't run, but she thought she could walk quickly. He looked in that direction for a while and thought about what to do in such a situation. But after that, the knight lifted her up, wrapping one arm around her to keep time. With the other, he covered them from the arrows that flew straight into their faces. Leah felt very uncomfortable. She realized that this man was more comfortable carrying her, but she felt very uncomfortable. The man, in turn, ran somewhere to the side and said they were going back to the knight's headquarters. The girl wanted to turn to him to ask him to put her on the ground. She realized it was best not to distract him, for he was really protecting their lives from being hit. Some more time passed from that moment, and they finally arrived at the tent where all the other knights had settled. The girl sat and sighed heavily. Leah was confused. She didn't know what to do now. The knights were all around her, and she didn't know where to go. A few hours before, when they had just arrived at headquarters, the girl had given one of the warriors a sword and asked if she could go home. But the man protested and said she couldn't do that yet and asked that she wait in that safe place. Then the man turned to Balt, who had brought the girl to the place, and asked him to keep an eye on her. And now, as she sat beside him, she was very sad. If she had known what was going to happen, she would have just handed over the sword when he asked her to. Now she was also very curious about what was going on at home. How on earth did Mom give birth? After all, she needed to get back as soon as possible and catch a boat for them. But at that moment, the girl suddenly heard someone scream. When she looked to the side, she saw the warriors who saw the dead body of the commander and did not hide their feelings and emotions. They were crying and screaming, not believing their eyes. Suddenly, one of the warriors approached them and turned to Brother Balt and asked if he wanted to say goodbye to the commander together. He came closer and closer, but at that moment, the knight blocked his path and pointed his weapon, telling him to stop. The boy was very surprised and did not understand why he was reacting so keenly. Leah was very surprised. She watched this warrior who had brought her to this headquarters and didn't understand how he could be so indifferent. After all, the person he had served all this time had just died. But then she turned her head to the side, thinking that he's probably like this, because he's probably been ordered to follow the girl, and he probably doesn't want to. But orders must be obeyed. She was silent for a while, but then told Balt to at least go and say goodbye to the leader he served. The girl looked straight ahead and didn't even turn to look at him, telling him that she wasn't running anywhere, so he didn't have to worry. The man cast a glance at her but said nothing to that. Without turning around, Leah said that she had heard that he was Guillaume's apprentice. She said that even though it was very difficult to serve and obey him, it would still be the last time he would be able to see him, even if he was already dead. The man made no reply. He remained silent for a while, interrupted only by the fire that had been lit nearby to cook dinner for the warriors. But then Leah heard some sobbing. She looked to the side and saw that the warrior who had bravely defended her was standing there crying. His tears ran down the helmet he was wearing and fell to the ground. There were so many of them that the girl was quite surprised. But at that moment one of the warriors approached them, telling the girl that Commander Gaudin and Marshal Severai would like to see her. She and her escort set off in that direction. The man walked ahead and did not say a word. When he heard the girl's limping footsteps, he suddenly stopped and glimpsed at her and asked her if it was very painful for her to walk. Leah thought about the fact that she had broken her whole leg, so it was logical that she was in pain. But she decided not to escalate the situation. They had more, so she said she put a splint on her leg, so she'll be fine and she'll be able to walk. But at that moment Bolt held out his hand to her and told her that he could help her. The girl was very surprised to see this. She thought he hated her and would not help her. Once she put her hand on his and then thanked him, saying that her legs were already hurting a lot and she was grateful that he had thought of and taken care of her. At this moment, the knight abruptly pulled his hand out when the girl said that he had a very responsive heart. Leah smiled, but she herself didn't understand what his reaction was. Of course, Templars usually avoided contact with women, but she didn't understand why he would remove his hand so abruptly. So she assumed that he was most likely very uncomfortable. But the man at that moment quickly removed his glove and began nervously examining his palm. After a while of silence, he turned to the girl to look at him. Leah shifted her gaze to his face and saw that the man had begun to remove his helmet. He looked incredibly handsome, and then he held out his gloved hand to her, telling her to take it now. She just stared at him for a while, unsure of what to do and trying to figure out what had even happened. But afterwards she did put her hand in his, and they thus went on after being silent for some time. Leah spoke first and wondered what would happen to them. Would he really go back to his family after all this? The man said, without turning around, that he was now going back to Paris to see the man who had taken care of him all this time. The girl didn't ask any more questions because they had already come to the right tent. When the man stopped, he said that the right place was right there. When he saw Leah, another guard immediately opened the room. The girl had already left for a while, but then she suddenly remembered that she had forgotten to thank him for his help. So she immediately turned around and apologized. But she didn't have time to say anything else, because the knight wished that God would keep her safe and smiled goodbye. And then he just left. After that, the girl went inside the tent, where several men were already gathered just waiting for her. In fact, there were many more people there than she had expected. In fact, the table with the various maps and figures for making plans stood the whole room and was fully occupied by various people. Looking at all the people in the circle, the girl realized that they had gathered the Council of 13 for some reason. In fact, the Council of 13 was a special meeting to choose a new leader. Of course, since the commander of her Merst, they were obligated to gather. However, the girl had also heard of the fact that it took several days to select the 13 best knights to lead. And now they had suddenly gotten together in just one day. It surprised her beyond belief. Leah was approached by a man and asked that she give her name, her father's name, and her place of residence. The girl didn't understand why she was even where she was. She realized that it was better to answer questions. She introduced herself and said that she was the daughter of Master Amos, and that their house and workshop were next to Saint Anne Isses, near the commander's house. She decided to also tell the story of the previous day. The girl said that the commander came in at night and entrusted them with his sword. Her mother suddenly went into labor, so she came instead of her father to deliver the sword. The men immediately began to chatter upon hearing this information, and Leah decided not to tell them about the secret device that was made in the sheath. She realized that if this was the secret the Templars were trying to hide, her family would definitely be in danger. For a while, everyone in the room discussed the situation. After that, the man who had first spoken to her said that she could go now. Pierre also turned to her and wished her good night. When the girl heard this, she breathed out a sigh of relief and thought that she was finally free. When she went outside, she almost ran away from that tent to stay away. After that, she went to her house. Leah was confused. She didn't know what was going on or why the commander needed a secret device in his sword, and she didn't understand why they were holding her captive and somehow even interrogating her. She only knew that she had to return to her home as soon as possible. All she could think about was that her family must be waiting for her arrival. She stopped for a while to catch her breath and let her leg rest, but at that moment she heard someone's footsteps behind her and was very frightened. She immediately turned around to see who it was, but when Leah looked back, she didn't see anyone there. This surprised her, for she had heard some strange noises. The girl looked into the darkness to see what was going on. Suddenly she froze with fear, because she saw a silhouette in the darkness. She was incredibly startled as the silhouette came closer and closer. In a trembling voice she asked, "Who is he anyway?" Leah was so frightened that she couldn't even step back. She stood there in a stupor, asking in a shaky voice who he was and what he wanted. The stranger came closer and closer to her. When he stepped out of the shadows, he removed the special helmet that covered his face from his head. When he stepped into the light, Leah immediately recognized the knight who had accompanied her all the time in captivity. He smiled and said hello, telling her she shouldn't worry, because it was him. The girl fell to the ground in surprise and was ready to scream. But soon she came to her senses and looked at Sir Balto in surprise. The man got off his horse and started to come closer to her, also apologizing for scaring her. He simply explained that it was very dangerous to walk alone, especially at night. Leah didn't bother to hide her emotions. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she said it was very dark, and his armor was so shiny that she was very frightened. The man was worried when he heard this. He didn't want to frighten her, but to help her, and he felt guilty that she was so frightened. Balta stepped closer to her and put his hand on her leg and apologized, saying that he thought she would recognize him from his armor and be at ease. Leah watched his actions carefully and quickly looked away. The knight's face was so close that she felt embarrassed, because she looked just awful right now in her opinion. He held out his hand to her and asked if she could stand. The girl looked at him in surprise for a while. She thought about it, and realized that the more she thought about it all, the more grateful she became to him. In this dangerous situation, he had come for her, and traveled such a dangerous path. When she stood up smiling and thanking him for it, she stood straight for a while, but suddenly she felt an incredibly intense pain in her broken leg. Leah immediately started to fall because of the pain in her leg, but the man managed to pick her up in time to keep her from crashing to the ground. He took her in his arms and carried her to another place, sitting her down on the stone steps to examine her leg. He quickly unbandaged her and began to examine her. Balta pressed some of the places where her leg was badly swollen and asked, wondering if she had walked all the way to the castle in such a terrible condition. The girl did not know what to say to him, so she mumbled something. At that moment, the man gave her a handkerchief and asked her to bear it for a while, because it would hurt a lot. Leah guessed what was in her mouth to keep her from screaming. He wanted her to bite down on that rag because of the pain. And so, when the girl did, she felt a great pain. The man had already started to do something to her leg. She began to cry out to the merciful God, the angel of healing, and asked them to heal her leg as soon as possible. Balta, who had finally finished, said in a trembling voice that it was done. He actually hated to hurt anyone, especially a beautiful girl like her. But he had no choice. The man took a stick that was nearby and began to carve the excess out of it. Then he put it under the bandage to hold it in place. When it was finished, he looked at the girl, who was holding back the pain and crying, and said that everything was fine and ready already. He turned around and started to walk away. Then the girl suddenly stopped him and told him that he had forgotten to pick up his handkerchief. The man waved her off and told her to keep it. The girl at that moment shifted her gaze to the examined handkerchief and realized that she wouldn't take it back either. He took a small cloak and threw it over her shoulders to keep Leah warm, and thought of the many sayings that a well-trained knight never loses his manners, even with a commoner. She looked at him while the man carefully tied her cloak and paid no attention to the girl. She, in turn, thought that he was being very polite and courteous to her. Leah was incredibly grateful to him, for not only did he have manners, but he was also always there for her when she was scared or having a hard time. When he finished tying her cloak, the girl smiled and thanked him for his kindness. Within the castle walls and at the knight's headquarters, she also added that she didn't know how she could thank him for it. Balta smiled back at her and said she might not thank him for some time. The girl sat for a moment, catching her breath, and then he put her on his horse and they rode to her house. They drove, and the girl occasionally cast glances at the man who walked beside her, and thought that to all his virtues could be attributed also beauty. In fact, she'd never met anyone so beautiful before, and didn't understand how anyone could ever be like that. Balta, seeing her staring at him, turned and wondered if she had something to say. The girl immediately looked away, embarrassed that she was staring at him so openly. She was silent for a while, then smiled awkwardly, and sifted through whether she remembered correctly what he had said about going to Paris. The man replied that she remembered correctly. Leah decided to change the subject a bit, and wondered if it was true that parts of Jesus' crown of thorns and other holy relics were kept there. Balta replied that this was correct. Then the girl said that some people say that His Majesty, King Philip, is a very handsome man. In reply, he smiled and said that this was also true. She also added that there are rumors that he is the most charming man in the world, and asked if it is true that His Majesty King Philip has healing powers. He answered that it was all true. He said nothing more, however, and the girl was very tense about the fact that the conversations ended no matter what she said. She wasn't sure if he was just being quiet, or if he just hated talking to women for some reason. Leah drove in silence for a while, then said that her father had also lived in Paris when he was younger, and he still had people close to him there. It was the only topic the man was interested in. He looked at her in surprise and wondered how he'd gotten there in the first place. She smiled and said that he had just gone off to war and then settled in this place. Bolta said that in that case he even admired him. The girl smiled back, but she herself realized that his face had finally softened, and it even pleased her, for it meant that their awkward situation would soon be resolved. Then she thought about the situation with her father, and realized that it wasn't really as admirable as he thought it was. All because when her father was 13, he ran away from home because he wanted to make his own fortune. Then he accompanied the late king to war as a blacksmith's assistant, and she doesn't know why someone as strange as her father would do such a thing. However, afterward, her mother and grandfather accepted her father as an adopted son, and thus Amos successfully erased his past and drastically changed his identity. Now her dad's making money and being successful. So he got what he wanted. They drove on in silence, and then the girl looked up at the stars and turned to Balta. Leah inquired about what kind of person their commander was in general, who had unfortunately died. At that moment, the man was a little surprised at such a question, so he even stopped. They continued on their way, however, and he said in a quiet voice that Sir Guillaume was a true knight, brave and noble. He had taken care of Balta from his earliest years, and had taught him a lot during that time. The boy even thought that serving such a great man was a great honor in his life. Leah glimpsed a glimpse of him, and saw the sad expression on his face. Then the girl realized that they had a fairly close relationship, and now it was very hard for him to lose it. But one question still bothered her. Why didn't he say goodbye to him then? He acted as if following the girl was more important than saying goodbye to someone close and dear to him. It became very hard for her to think about all this, so she squeezed the ropes she used to control her horse even tighter, and for a while, she just kept silent. As they pulled up to the houses, the girl said cheerfully that this was exactly the same St. Anne's Crossing, their house in the alley to the right of the commander's mansion. She leaned closer to him and said that of course he must surely know about it, for he was his apprentice. But the man was suddenly wary and asked her to be careful. Leah, hearing this, was very surprised. She didn't understand why she had to be more careful. The girl stripped off her horse in order to be on guard in case of anything. When Balta saw this, he immediately became worried and started yelling for her to climb back up, seeing that too bad an effect on her leg. But the girl calmly stood up on her bandaged leg. She smiled and was even ready to ride on it, saying that her leg didn't hurt anymore. The man was very surprised to hear this. He moved closer to her and asked how such a thing was even possible. Leah was surprised and said she didn't know what to say to the man who had treated her. Then she said that maybe she just wasn't broken. At this point, she immediately ran to the door of her house and asked him not to leave at once, but to wait a little while. She opened the front door, thanked the gentleman, and said she would give him some bread, salami, and cheese for the road. Leah smiled and said that she wasn't bragging, but that her cheese was incredibly good. Balta said nothing, but became very serious. When the girl wasn't paying attention, she opened the doors and loudly asked her daddy if he was asleep. She then turned to her little sister, Rachel, and told her that her little sister was back. She was about to move on, but realized that no one was answering. Just as she was about to go into the room, someone pushed her back. It was Balta, the first to enter the apartment. Leah was very surprised when he did that, and wondered in a trembling voice if something was wrong. She could see how serious he was, and also how he drew his weapon. The man didn't say anything. He just went inside and stopped. The girl followed him in and stopped as well. She couldn't believe her eyes that it had really happened. It was a horrible sight, especially for the girl, for as soon as she entered, she saw many corpses lying on the floor. In fact, Accra is the capital of the Holy Land Kingdom that has been captured. this land of glory and hell, joy and sorrow. And while wars were fought over the plundering of this very land, the knights and people of Accra remained steadfast, and all because they believed that their God was right there with them, and everything was happening just the way he wanted it to happen. They had truly believed that God's will would be done. But now that Leah had returned home and seen the corpses of her family, she was beginning to doubt that assertion. The girl walked farther and farther away and called out hopefully for her dad and mom. But as soon as she got closer, she saw their bloody bodies. Leah was terrified. She couldn't believe this was really happening, and she hoped she was just asleep right now. But if not, she doesn't understand why her mom and dad don't wake up when she calls them. At that moment, the girl saw blood on the walls and thought that someone must have attacked them. But it was horrible. She was shocked, but decided to go outside and shouted into the distance for at least someone to come out and show themselves. However, nothing was happening. There was complete silence outside, and she noticed that it was unusually quiet this night, as if a storm had blown through. The girl could not believe that this was really happening. Then various feelings came over her and she cried. Balta immediately ran up to her to comfort her and give her some moral support. And she started screaming loudly at that moment, saying that those idiot Mamelukes, it was all their doing. They killed her family and maybe even the whole town. She spoke in a trembling voice, harming civilians who didn't even know how to hold swords in their hands. That's very low. Her family had done nothing wrong, and she didn't understand why they were killed so cruelly. Leah fell into the man's arms and beat her hands on his chest because of her strong emotions. She said she wished they would all die that way, cursed for this terrible atrocity. She continued crying and screaming loudly, but then she suddenly thought about her parents and basically her family, and realized that she hadn't noticed her sister's body there. The girl looked around and asked the man where Rachel was. He didn't answer, for he didn't even know who she was talking about. Then she dropped from her seat and ran straight back into the house, thinking about not letting this happen. She searched every corner of her house, but she couldn't find her little sister. The girl was trying to do it all so fast that she didn't even have time to shuffle her feet, causing her to twist her sore leg. But at that moment, Balta managed to run up to her in time and picked the girl up to keep her from falling to the ground. He turned to her in a sad voice and asked if she was all right. Leah just stayed silent for a while, too sad to answer. But then she turned to him and told him that her little sister had disappeared somewhere, and she had just turned 4 years old not long ago. She didn't look at the man and wondered if it was even possible that she had been taken with him. In fact, her little sister was as beautiful as an angel, and in just a few days she might be sold for a huge price somewhere on the market. Balta pondered for a while, then helped the girl up and said that if she had been taken as a prisoner, then she was still alive. Leah was very much surprised. She cried again. She could still hold herself up for a while, but after that she fell to her knees and screamed loudly. When morning came, the man suggested that she bury her parents. They moved closer to the forest, and he did the job, while she sat nearby with a stony expression. Leah sat silent the whole time. Then, when the deed was done, she plucked a few flowers and placed them on the buried bodies of her parents. It was hard enough for Balta, too, but it was even harder to watch it all, for he knew perfectly well how painful it was to lose loved ones. They were silent for a while. Then the man suddenly saw something white fall near him. It surprised him very much. He turned to the girl and said that it must have snowed. Leah, who had been standing there mentally saying goodbye to her parents the whole time, was surprised. She looked around and realized it wasn't snow. Indeed, it didn't even look like snow. There were many rose trees around them, and the petals were falling from them. Leah turned away from him and said that it wasn't snow, but almonds her father had planted in this spot, and these were the petals falling from them, for it was just about the time they were blooming. She said that every spring those trees made her daddy miss his homeland. He said it reminded him of the snowstorms of his childhood. She sighed heavily and said in a quiet voice that he had always missed his homeland. The man was incredibly sad, because he wanted to support her somehow, but he didn't know what he could do. For a while he just sat there. After that he put his hands together and prayed for her parents' blessing, at least in the next world. There was complete silence. Leah also mentally began to pray for her parents, and then suddenly she heard the man start coughing loudly. She noticed it right away. You see, Everything was fine before, but after that, suddenly a loud rumbling sound came from his stomach. The man immediately felt very embarrassed, and he even blushed because of it. The girl was silent for a while. She held back her laughter. Then she asked him if he wanted something to eat since he was so hungry. Balto was incredibly embarrassed. He hid his face in his hands and said that it was actually fine. After that, he said that if she did have even a small piece of bread, he wouldn't mind trying it. The girl asked in surprise if he really wanted only bread, for she could give him some ham and cheese. When the man heard this, he was immediately indignant and said that he, as a gentleman, could not afford it. But she decided not to contradict him much. So they soon returned home, and the girl scrutinized every shelf. She was glad there was food left in the house after all, and she put a few loaves of bread on the table. Leah was alone. Then suddenly she heard some strange sound coming from the fireplace nearby. The girl was immediately alert. She looked carefully in that direction and could not believe that these criminals had the nerve to stay in her house. She slowly moved closer and wondered who was there. The noise grew louder, and then a silhouette appeared from behind the dark fireplace. Leah looked closer and saw a small hand peeking out. After that, she saw her sister's crying face. She looked at her with a pitiful gaze, and was, in fact, very happy to see her big sister. Leah, seeing Rachel, immediately ran up to her and started hugging her hard. She couldn't believe that the girl was really all right and that she was home. Rachel started to scream and turned to her sister, asking why she had only come now, since she had said she would be back soon. It had been a long time since she'd been back. Leah, not listening for a while, asked her sister if she was all right and if she had any pain. Then she asked her sister if the Mamluk troops had come all the way to this place, and then she started calling them foul language. Rachel, hearing the names of these warriors, immediately said that she had misunderstood everything. The girl was very surprised and looked at her sister carefully, not understanding what she meant. The girl came closer to her and told her that it was not the Mamluks, but Uncle Pierre and the other brothers. They broke into the house and did all this. It all started back at sunset when the man returned to the house to his wife who was in labor. She was so exhausted that she even began to faint. Amos ran up to her and began to shake her, asking her to stay with him. The midwife should be here any minute now. Before that, he had time to examine his wife and realize that the fetus was misplaced. If this continues, both the baby and his wife will be in incredible danger. He stood over his wife and even cried, but tried to remain calm. Then Rachel came to him, and in a trembling voice turned to her father and said that she was incredibly scared. The girl was trembling and crying. Amos got up from his seat and put on a smile, telling the girl that everything was fine and she shouldn't worry. He put his hand on the girl's shoulder and said that if she was suddenly scared, she should find a place to hide and cover her ears for a while. For example, she could hide in the bonfire pit. He knows she likes to sit there. He was actually incredibly emotional, but tried to hold back so Rachel would stop panicking. He was shaking all over, but he put a smile on his face and said that Daddy would protect her mommy and everything would be okay. Rachel calmed down a bit, wiped her tears, and climbed into the fire pit to hide from it all. As soon as she was there, she immediately covered her ears. But suddenly the man heard someone knocking on the door. He thought, of course, that the midwife had arrived and was very happy. Amos immediately opened the door and said that she had arrived just in time, for his wife was inside. But when he saw the people who were standing, he realized it was not the midwife. Uncle Pierre and several other men were standing in front of him. The man was incredibly surprised to see them. Then in a trembling voice, retreating back into the apartment, asked what was even going on and why they had arrived. He asked if the sword had been delivered, but Pierre replied in a cold and arrogant voice that he need not worry, for it had been delivered. Then he asked why they had come to see him. Amos was incredibly surprised. He asked in a shaky voice what they meant, but then he guessed and told them not to do it. The man fell to his knees and told Sir Pierre that all he had done was fix the broken device. He had told no one about it, and even Leah knew nothing of the need. But the man apologized to him and told him they had no choice but to silence anyone who saw him. As sorry as he was, orders are orders. When Amos heard this, he asked if they were going to kill him from the beginning. They knew perfectly well that there was no other way to do it, but they asked him to do it anyway. Then he remembered his daughter and asked where Leah was. At that moment another man, who was standing next to Pierre, turned to him and said that if he had delivered the sword himself, only he would have died, and that would have been the end of it. And he wondered why he had sent his daughter on this mission in the first place. When he heard this, he was very surprised. The man realized that these jokes would not be, and would definitely kill him. Therefore, he had to run away urgently. Of course, he didn't know that it would all be useless, because they were much stronger and faster than him. And so, just as he rushed to run away, one of the men asked where he was even going, and they all ran after him. But all that was useless because Pierre just took his weapon and threw it right at his back. So the man couldn't even dodge it because he didn't see it. Rachel, for her part, continued to sit in the fireplace, shaking with fear. She could hear everything, but she knew that she must not go out. Amos in turn tried to get up. He still had strength, but too little. A man approached him, and one of them had already started to draw his sword. He leaned against the stone wall and addressed the Knights of Honor, saying that his wife had recently died, and even if she had survived, she would not last long. So he asked them very strongly not to be a threat to her. He mentally sent signs to his daughter not to go out. He, in turn, blocked her exit, so that she would not even think about it. He thought about how she shouldn't worry, because her daddy was fine, and her mommy too, and her little sister would definitely save her. In the meantime, she should just sit quietly and try not to cry. He really wanted Rachel to tell her sister to run as far and as fast as possible. He smiled at her and apologized, saying that he was really sorry for the way things had turned out. Shortly after they finished the man, one of them came over and put his finger in front of his nose to see if he was breathing, but he lay breathless. Then the guy stepped aside and said that he was now dead. The other man turned to Pierre and asked him what he had said about having 2 daughters. One is named Leah, and she is now at headquarters. Where is the other one? Pierre turned sideways and said he couldn't see her now. Surely she must have fled to the village when she first saw all this. She would be very hard to find during the battle. The man, hearing this, immediately cussed. He started shouting and asked when she had managed to get out. Pierre was unable to answer him on this point. So for a while they were just silent. Then the man sighed heavily and said that first they would let Leah go, and it's imperative that someone walk her home safely. Then that child will find her little sister on her own, and she will surely come back. And when they're all ready together, the warriors will enter the battle and deal with the 2 of them right away. It'll be much easier that way. When Pierre heard this, he was very indignant, and said that this was not the right thing to do. After all, they were still children, and it was impossible for the blacksmith to show this secret device to his daughters. Even if he did, they probably wouldn't even realize what they were seeing. But the man was outraged, and told Brother Pierre that keeping this secret was a very important part of their mission, and no one knew what would happen if these children started talking about this device. Pierre, hearing this, realized that there was some truth in what he said after all, and it really could have happened. The other man turned around and said that as soon as the child named Leah left the headquarters, they should immediately assign someone to track her and keep an eye on her under no circumstances. He also ordered the warriors to find his sister and massacre the 2 of them. And when Rachel told the story, Leah was very surprised and asked if it was all true. The girl waved her head in response, and then Leah thought about the fact that the one sent by the Knights Templar was probably Balta. It was very hard for her to accept this situation because the man was so polite and kind to her. He always helped, and Dasha was able to heal her leg somehow. But Leah guessed that he was probably just trying to let her guard down. She had let her guard down, and that was how she'd found Rachel. She was very worried at the word that the warriors were going to deal with the 2 of them. But she tried to calm her panic, for she knew exactly what she had to do. So she got to her feet and thought about the fact that she needed to get Rachel as soon as possible and just run. Leah very quickly gathered some belongings, food, money, and various other valuables into a knot, tying it to her body. Then she went to Rachel and told her to hug her sister tightly and not to let her go. The little girl was a little surprised at the request, but Leah asked her to be quiet, because they had to run away without anyone noticing. Rachel did as her sister said and asked where they would go now. The girl looked ahead and said that she didn't know, but first they had to get to the boat and leave, and then they would decide. When they went outside, the girl gave the horse something to eat. When they went outside, the girl gave the horse something to eat. But the girl asked her to keep her voice down, because that would attract more attention. Leah sat her younger sister down first, and then climbed in herself. But then the horse got spooked for some reason and reared up, making lots of loud noises. Of course, all these sounds were heard by Balta as well, so he immediately ran toward them, asking them to wait, for the horse had already even begun to run. Leah didn't want to stop, for she realized that they could be caught. She started screaming with tears in her eyes, saying that she was really asking for it, because in any situation it was better to just run away. When the man saw the look on her face, he was surprised, and didn't understand why she reacted that way. But he decided not to be too assertive, so he let her go. The girl in turn, without turning back, steered the horse straight toward the exit from the neighborhood. He ran out into the center of the street and shouted back at her. The girl immediately turned around to see what was going on. She saw that he was standing with his hands down, and in one of them he was holding a small branch, just the branch with the flowers that her father had planted. He looked her straight in the eye, and tears came to his eyes. In fact, this guy's memories of his past life begin when he was 6 years old. Balta remembered how he lay in the street with his clothes tattered and very dirty, not even lifting his gaze. Suddenly some boy, very handsomely dressed, came up to him and turning to him inquired his name. Balta, for his part, began to rise to his feet and looking at the boy with a tired look said his name. The boy was surprised to see this boy, who was almost his own age. He led him out of the dark alley, took him aside and threw on his cloak, saying his name was Philip. Philip moved closer to him and whispered in his ear that he should never forget that he had saved his life. After this miraculous rescue, the lad was able to start a new life, hoping to live the rest of his life as he wished, though he had no certain hopes. That's why he vowed that he would give his body and everything he had to God. It was the only right decision he made on his own. When he was accepted into a special camp for warriors, he began to train there. However, most of the training sessions were unsuccessful, and in one of them he fell again, making a mistake. A knight came up to him and indignantly asked him what he was even thinking and why he kept making this mistake. He said that if the boy began to let his guard down, the heathen's spear would pierce his body, and then, looking sternly at the boy, asked if he even realized how serious the situation was. Balta lowered his head and began wiping the blood from his nose, which had gone. He turned to Sir Jacques and apologized for his mistake. Jacques, of course, asked him to repeat it over and over again, even in spite of his injuries. So the boy vowed to become a brave warrior and a determined monarch, to live his life only for God. When he was a little older, he was taken to a more senior warrior in rank, and the latter told him that they had the greatest hopes for him. "You're a good enough lad," he added. Balta was delighted at what he heard and continued to glow with joy. The man told him not to neglect his training, to keep his mind and body in shape, and never to miss the dinner prayers. And he was incredibly pleased to be noticed and praised. He was shining with joy when he left the commander's office. After this conversation, he met some of the boys who were nearby. One of the boys turned to his friends and asked if they had seen, for he said that the commander had called him back to him again, for he was especially fond of Balta. He laughed and said that even though the guy was as skinny as a stick and had nothing to offer but his pretty face, it apparently didn't stop the commander. Then one of his friends laughed out loud and asked if maybe that was why they were so close. Balta turned around and started to walk away. And then he heard one of them say that he had heard that dating pretty boys was fashionable among powerful people. But when the guy heard those words, he couldn't take it anymore. He turned to Raymond, who was just talking, spreading all these dirty rumors, and said that he was just a disgusting person. At that moment, their conversation was suddenly interrupted by the voice of one of the knights, who ran up to them and asked if they were missing their training again. The guys immediately began to run away, because it was the sergeant who was their personal trainer. They didn't understand where he was coming from. As the boys began to scatter, Jacques became even more angry. He looked over and saw Balta and asked if the boys were bothering him. The boy put his head down. He realized that if he told the truth, he'd get in trouble even more. So he simply told Sergeant that they were just talking. Balta vowed to abide by God's teachings, oppose pagan groups, and always obey the orders of God's representatives. One day they were invited to a very influential priest's house. Balta had grown up and was looking more and more beautiful. When the man saw him, he said that he had been born with a manifestation of the devil. The knights of the monarchy became very concerned and wondered what it even meant. The priest explained that his appearance led others to sin. He then turned to the boy and asked him if it was true that boys of his age were jealous of him, and that girls followed him around when they saw him. But Balta answered nothing, but nodded his head. Then the commander became indignant and told the priest that the boy was only a child, and it was too early for him to do this. To which the priest replied that age was absolutely no excuse, and they should definitely monitor it from an early age so as not to miss the point. Balta, who had been silent all this time, suddenly spoke. He turned to them and told the priest that he would follow his words. He dedicates all his property, and even his body, to God. He would keep God's teachings, oppose pagan groups, and always obey the orders of God's representatives. He lived only for God. But as he was praying one day, he suddenly asked himself a question he had been pondering for several days, and wondered, if this was really so, what was life for if he had to give everything to God? He removed the cloth that was wrapped around his mouth and said that he was very afraid of pain and preferred a lazy life to a diligent one. He prefers a cool breeze to a stuffy hood. Every time he prays, instead of being filled with peace, he experiences a deep sense of emptiness and even despondency. Balta's hands suddenly began to shake, and he said in a trembling voice that he did not know how to overcome this feeling of loneliness that was consuming him from within. Then the boy couldn't stand it any longer and cried as hard as he could. He spoke directly to God and asked, was he really walking for him such a dull and horrible life? Then the boy realized that he had made a mistake and began to bang his head hard against the stone floor. He was beating so hard that blood even began to spurt out in different directions. In fact, he couldn't believe that he was having such blasphemous thoughts all the time. Balta was sad, but he thought it was because he was praying too little, so he decided to pray until the thoughts stopped. He would pray until all these terrible things were out of his head. For what he seeks is a sacred concept. It is the world of the cold, cruel mind. So he must ignore the thick darkness of the prayer room. He must hide his deep inner emptiness, for it would change nothing. As a result, Balto even prayed all day long for the spans. When morning came, he came to have breakfast before training. The boys, when they saw him, were very surprised. He looked very exhausted and tired. He calmly took his food and stepped aside and began to eat, thinking about the fact that he had prayed so long that he hadn't even had time to sleep. But at that moment, the commander suddenly came up to him and, seeing his tired face, asked him if he was overexcited. He also asked if he remembered what day it was. Balta looked at him in surprise at the video. He was so out of his mind that he didn't even remember what the commander had told him the previous day. When the man said in a joyful voice that this was the day he would finally graduate and become a squire, the boy immediately thought about it. The commander in turn said that they had somewhere to go, so he should take the mulak to the main gate. Of course, the guy immediately did not question anything, because it was an order that he must fulfill. And soon after breakfast he went to the stoina, where he took one of the mullahs. The boy himself mentally tried to pull himself together. He needed to clear his mind and focus on important matters, so as not to embarrass himself. He realized that it might even make his life easier, so he took one of the mullahs out and led him to the commander. Balta thought about the fact that he had chosen to ignore the whispering emptiness inside him and live his life for God. Therefore, he must stick to that rule. But in truth, he had no idea that what would happen that day would change the boy's life forever. Balta took the mule and began to lead it toward the commanders.